Hey, young scholars. This is going to be the first lecture of three that's going to help talk about that second FRQ you're going to be faced with, what I like to call the Research FRQ. The first FRQ is an application FRQ where you're given a scenario and you need to apply a handful of terms to the scenario. And then remember that second FRQ is the Research FRQ, where you need to analyze some kind of psychological research. So for this first part, I'm going to do the first and second of these kind of four steps. So research FRQs usually are going to ask you about the following things. It's going to ask about the research design itself, or what kind of type, what type of research it is. It's going to ask about kind of the details of the methodology. What did the psychologist do? It'll ask you to interpret and sometimes create or graph some results. And then also, it's not uncommon for them to have you look for some mistakes or some errors that take place with the research itself. Now, it doesn't mean that the FRQ will ask all four of these things. This is just a general overview of what I have seen over and over again looking at these past research FRQs. So the research FRQ that you see this year may not have you do all of these things, or it may have you do something that I don't talk about, that I haven't mentioned, and we just don't know until you see it. But if you can master these four things, you're going to be in really good shape for the research FRQ. So for this lecture, let's just look at the first two: research design and methodology. So research design. Basically, what you will likely have to do when you see that FRQ is first try to figure out what type of research is being done. It's a big mistake that students make, is they just sometimes assume that psychological research means an experiment. And that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's an experiment, but sometimes it's a different type of research. So I have listed here some things that you should look for. Descriptive research is when psychologists are able to observe behavior and note what is happening with participants, but they are not able to draw conclusions of cause and effect for descriptive research. So there are some examples of descriptive research. Surveys. For surveys, think you're gathering lots of information. They're really efficient. They are cost efficient. They're timely. But we sometimes have some opportunities for bias and for framing and things with surveys that we need to be careful of. Case studies. A case study is an in-depth look at a particular person or a group of people. Maybe it's a case like Jeannie, right? The woman who was locked in a room for 13 years. Maybe a case study is looking at people who've damaged their amygdala, and so it's this look at a specific group of people. And we can get a lot of information from a case study, but we can't generalize it to the population, right? And naturalistic observation, where you can't manipulate the environment. You simply look at participants in their natural setting. So these are all examples of descriptive research, and you should be on the lookout for some of those perhaps red flags. Correlational studies, when you have two factors that are co-related to one another. If you are looking at the relationship, for example, between watching violent movies on television and getting into fights at school. Well, that's a correlational study. It's looking at whether or not there is a relationship between two things. Keep in mind, it's important that correlations do not equal causation. Is there a correlation between consuming sugar and hyperactivity? We could try to test that like an experiment, and some people have, but you got to be careful when you're reading the FRQ. Is it talking about an experiment, or is it talking simply about a correlation, about two things being related to one another? And then, of course, experimental research. For experimental research, you have the researcher actually manipulating a variable. And I have that word underlined, manipulate, because I've seen FRQs where you won't score the point unless you specifically use that word, manipulation. And so manipulation would be when a when a researcher is changing a variable to see what happens. They have a controlled environment, right? Maybe it's a laboratory, but it doesn't have to be a lab. They have a controlled environment. They manipulate a variable and they measure to see what's the result, what is the dependent variable. And it is only with an experiment that you can prove cause and effect. Okay? So let's go into methodology. And for the sake of methodology, I'm going to focus just on experiment, but know that methodology does not have to simply be an experimental research. You can apply this to correlational and descriptive as well. But methodology, let's say you're looking at the FRQ and it does happen to be an experiment. There are some words you should look for. If you see these words, it's your clue that what you're reading is an experiment. So first of all, look for things like single blind or double blind study. If you have a single blind study, that means that the participant is unaware of what group they are in. Maybe they're in the experimental group, maybe they are in the control group. If it's a double blind study, both the participant and the researcher are unaware of what group the participants are in. And so this is really common when we're testing things like pharmaceutical studies, where maybe you have a psychologist or a psychiatrist who's developing a new drug and they want to see its effectiveness. Well, some participants will be part of the experimental group and they will get the actual drug. And then other participants will be in a control group and they'll be given a placebo, right? They'll be given a pill or an injection or whatever it may be that has no therapeutic value. And so be on the lookout for words like double blind, experimental group, control group, placebo. All of those indicate that it is an experiment that is being done. Independent and dependent variables, those are terms that you have learned about since middle school science. AP Psychology, I still see those terms assessed in AP Psych students, and I still see students miss them. There's a couple of reasons. One is the obvious of just trying to keep them separate, right? Remember, independent, it's what I manipulate, it's what I change. And the dependent variable, you can think of, it's essentially the results, right? The dependent variable depends on what happens with the independent variable. Maybe I'm curious about sleep and your amount of focus, okay? And so I manipulate how much you can sleep. You come to my lab, and for some participants, I allow them to sleep for 9 hours, and for other participants, I restrict their sleep to 2 hours. The independent variable is how much sleep they get. It's what I am manipulating. And then the dependent variable in this example would be focus, right? How easily or how efficiently you can focus. Well, that will depend on the sleep. It's the dependent variable. Now remember, our kind of key phrase is what we call operational definitions. An operational definition is how we actually measure the variables. The independent variable is sleep, but the operational definition of the independent variable would be 9 hours of sleep or 2 hours of sleep. The dependent variable is focus. Well, what does that mean? How will we measure that, right? If you wanted to replicate this study, what are you going to do to see if it's the same as mine? I need to somehow indicate how I'm measuring focus. And so I don't know what that would be. I don't know if it's how long you can stare at a picture, and I just time how long you can stare at something, how long you can engage in a boring conversation, how many math problems you can do before you get sidetracked and look somewhere else. I don't know, but I need to somehow measure the dependent variable. Ask yourself, if you were to chart this on a graph, what would you put on that y-axis, right? If you had focus on a level of 1 to 10, well, what does a 6 mean, right? So make sure that you're aware of those operational definitions of the variables. Populations and samples. Population is everyone that would fall within the group you are curious about studying. Maybe the population is everyone in the world. Maybe the population is just males. Maybe the population is just teenagers between 13 and 19. It's everyone you're curious about studying. It may not be realistic to study everyone in the population. And so you take a sample. And a sample is just a percentage of the people in the population. We see lots of sampling right now as we have an election, right? And so you might see a sample about possible voters. Well, they're not interviewing everyone. They're taking a sample of people. It's a percentage of the population. And then the last two terms I have on this slide here, random selection and random assignment. Random selection is trying to figure out who will be part of your sample, right? For a random selection, anyone who is in the sample should have an equal chance of being part of your sample. Sorry, anyone part of your population should have an equal chance of being part of your sample. And so if they are curious about voting, right, and possible voters, and so they send out a survey to 10,000 Verizon wireless subscribers, well, that's not a random selection. Because if you don't subscribe to Verizon Wireless, you have zero chance of being part of the sample. So again, sample is the percentage of the population. A random selection is making sure that anyone in the population has an equal shot of being part of that sample. Now for random assignment, highlight that word, underline it, circle it, put a star next to it. Random assignment is a big red flag that what we're talking about is an experiment. You would not have random assignment for descriptive research, right? If I back it up here, random assignment does not apply to descriptive research. It does not apply to correlational studies. Random assignment only applies to experiments. With random assignment, you have your participants already. You have the people who are going to be part of your study. Some of those participants will be part of your control group who get a placebo. Some of those participants will be part of your experimental group. And you want to make sure that everyone who's participating has an equal chance of being in either group. You are assigning groups, right? So if you have 50 participants in your experiment, you want to make sure that you randomly assign half of them to one group and half to the other. If you see an FRQ with that phrase random assignment, they are talking about an experiment. Or if you are supposed to be writing about an experiment, you can use that phrase random assignment to help make sure you know what you're talking about. So that is it for this part of the lecture. Our next lecture, we'll talk about the second two parts of breaking down a research FRQ, and that is interpreting the results and then looking for errors that might take place. So that's our next lecture. For now, I hope you took some notes over this. It should hopefully help you for that research FRQ. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask. And of course, good luck.